In Falls County, Texas, 1883 town, a woman lived alone on 40 acres and asked nothing from anyone.
The morning they came, she was already standing at the door. She heard it before she saw it, and she did not move. They did not slow down enough. They did not ask.
What they left behind a Dow, she would turn into something they never imagined.
The fog came in low off the little river that morning, settling into the furrows behind the barn and spreading across the yard in thin white sheets that dissolved slowly as the sun climbed. Odessa Birch moved through it without hurrying, her apron already damp at the hem, a clay bowl of cracked corn balanced against her hip. The chickens came before she called them, reading the particular rhythm of her footsteps the way a body learns to read weather. She scattered the feed in an arc and watched them move in, and for a moment the yard held nothing but that ordinary sound and the soft burn of September lifting off the grass. She did not hear the wagon until it turned off the main road. The wheels were heavy. She could tell by the way the sound dropped in pitch when the horses slowed, and the axles took the full weight of the load. She did not look up. 4 years of running this place alone had made her deliberate about what deserved her attention, and a wagon on the road was not yet her business. She finished scattering the corn, set the bowl on the fence post, and wiped her hands on her apron. The crash came from the front of the property, a sound like a wave breaking through timber, followed by the low, continuous rush of something pouring, and beneath it, the clean snap of the gate post giving way. She walked around the side of the house. 2 men on a flatbed wagon sat watching the last of the load slide down from the raised bed, a cascade of pale broken shells fanning out across the ground and pushing through the gap where her front gate had stood. The gate itself lay at an angle, one hinge torn from the post, the wood split along the grain. 12 years that post had held. Edgar had set it in the spring of 1871, tamping the base himself, and she remembered the afternoon clearly because Callum had stood beside him, handing him stones to pack around the footing. One of the men looked back at her. He said something to the other and they both laughed. And then the driver flicked the reins, and the horses pulled forward, and the wagon rolled away down the road without stopping. Odessa stood at the edge of the pile, the shells spread across a span of ground 15 feet wide, knee-deep in the center, thinning toward the edges where they scattered across the grass in a pale lace. Pecan shells, thousands of them, broken and whole and split, still carrying the faint sweetness of the processing house. She had passed the weed mill enough times to know that scent. Harlan Weed had been operating his mill for 11 years, and disposing of his waste however cost him the least, and apparently this week it had cost him nothing at all. She crouched down, not to inspect the damage, but because something made her reach into the pile, and when she opened her hand she was holding a dozen shells or more, irregular pieces ranging from a fragment no larger than her thumbnail to a curved section, still shaped like the inside of the husk. She turned them slowly in her palm. Some felt dry against her skin, clean, with a small dense weight to them. Others felt different in a way she could not immediately name. She picked through what she was holding, moving pieces from one side of her palm to the other, and after a while she let them fall back and stood up. She went to the barn and brought out the low wooden stool she used when she mended tack, set it at the edge of the pile, and sat down. Callum arrived in the middle of the afternoon, driving in from Lot in the small buggy he used for his rounds. He came around the side of the house the same way she had that morning, and when he saw the pile and the broken gate, he stopped walking. He was 34 years old and kept his appearance carefully, the habits of a man who worked in an office and took that to mean something. He stood for a moment, taking in the scope of it. Weed's men did this. It was not a question. She did not look up from her work. She had divided the pile into sections she could reach from the stool and was moving through each one systematically, lifting handfuls and sorting pieces into 2 smaller piles. She had started on a piece of burlap laid on the ground. "Mama," he came closer. "I can arrange for someone to haul this away. There's a man in Lot who takes debris removal, reasonable rate. Just say the word." She lifted another handful, let a few pieces fall back, kept the rest. "This doesn't have to be your problem." She looked at him then. "It's already in my yard." He watched her for a moment the way he watched her sometimes when he did not know how to argue further, then went and inspected the gate. He tested the broken post with both hands, rocking it slightly in the ground. "I can fix this. I'll come back Saturday." She nodded and returned to her sorting. He stood nearby a while longer, then went inside to leave a small parcel of provisions on the kitchen table. And when he drove away, the yard was quiet again, and she sat in the September heat with the pile in front of her and her hands moving through it without stopping. She had grown up 10 miles from this land, the daughter of a woman who put up 40 jars of preserves every summer and a father she barely remembered. and she had learned most of what she knew from paying attention to the world directly in front of her. Edgar had called it stubbornness. She had called it accuracy. The difference had defined most of their marriage, and she had missed him every day since the fever took him in the autumn of 1879, 4 years gone now. What she missed most was not the arguments, but the presence of someone else who noticed things. Edgar had been a noticing man. That was the quality in him she had loved first and never stopped appreciating. The tools he had left her were more useful than his debts. In a corner of the barn, beneath a canvas that had stiffened with age, sat a machine Edgar had spent 3 winters tinkering with, a pressing device adapted from equipment used in early road construction, a frame of heavy iron with a threaded screw mechanism that forced material through a shaped die at one end. He had used it experimentally with a tar and gravel compound, testing whether compressed material could be shaped into a consistent form for laying road surface. The work came to nothing practical, but he kept the machine, because he could never stand to discard a thing that still functioned. It sat in the corner unchanged from the day he died, and Odessa worked around it the way she worked around all of Edgar's remnants, with a practicality that did not require her to decide what she felt about it. By the time the light began to go that first evening, she had sorted through perhaps a quarter of the pile. She stood and stretched her back and looked at what she had separated. The 2 piles were not dramatically different in appearance. Anyone walking past would have taken them for the same material. But her hands knew otherwise, and she had learned long ago to trust the education her hands had acquired over nearly 60 years of working with physical things. She picked up one piece from the better pile and one from the other and held them both, comparing. The difference was there. She simply did not yet have a name for it. She went inside, put water on for coffee, and found Edgar's old account ledger in the drawer where she kept it. The pages were less than half filled with his entries, the handwriting angular and careful, each line recording weight and date and party to a transaction with the economy of a man who respected the precision of numbers. She turned past his last entry and opened to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. Below it she wrote what she had observed, in plain language, the way she might write a letter. She noted the approximate weight of the load, the rough proportions she had sorted into each pile, the qualities she had noticed. She did not know yet what she was recording toward. She recorded it anyway. The next morning she sent a note to Weeds Mill with the boy who delivered eggs for her on Tuesdays, requesting that the driver of each future delivery sign a paper acknowledging the weight of the load. She expected to hear nothing back, or to be laughed at, which were often the same thing. Instead, the following week's wagon arrived with a driver who seemed already to have been told about the request, and who signed the paper she held out with the resigned patience of a man who had been given stranger instructions and expected to receive them again. She saved the signed slip in the ledger. She filled a jar with a sample from the load, pressed a piece of paper around the lid with the date written on it in pencil, and set it on the shelf above Edgar's workbench. Then she went back to sorting. This became her mornings. The dew would still be on the grass when she came out, and she would work through the shells in the early light while the air was cool. Moving along the edge of the pile on her low stool, her hands developing a rhythm that required less and less conscious attention as the weeks passed. There was something almost restful in the repetition, though she would not have described it that way to anyone who asked. It was more that her hands were busy in one direction while her mind was free to move in another, and in that separation she found herself turning over the problem of what she was sorting and why. She had kept chickens for 30 years. She knew before opening the nesting box which hens had laid, and which had not, from a quality of sound in the coop, a temperature in the air. She knew good soil from exhausted soil by the color and the smell and the way a handful of it broke apart in her fingers. These were not things she had been taught in any deliberate sense. They were things she had learned by being present and paying attention over a long span of time, and they had become so woven into ordinary action that she rarely thought of them as knowledge at all. What her hands were doing with these shells was the same kind of learning. She did not yet know what it was teaching her. The shelf in the barn filled slowly with dated jars, each one a record of a specific delivery. She could look at any jar and know the week it came from, the approximate weather, the proportion she had sorted as acceptable versus questionable. She began noting in the ledger how long she had spent on each delivery, how much weight she had worked through per hour, what the rejected proportion looked like compared to the accepted one. The numbers did not yet tell a story, but they were accumulating toward one. She did not tell Callum about the jars or the ledger. He came on Saturdays to work on the gate, which he rebuilt properly over 2 weekends, replacing the split post and recutting the hinge mortises so the hardware sat flush. He worked quietly and competently, and she brought him cold water, and sometimes sat nearby without either of them needing to speak. He was a good son in the ways he knew how to be, and she understood that his worrying came from love rather than from any specific doubt in her. He doubted the situation. The situation was reasonable to doubt. What she could not explain to him, because she had not explained it to herself, was that she was not approaching the pile as a problem. She was approaching it as information. It was on a Tuesday morning in early October that she pushed her hand into a fresh delivery and pulled it back. The shells against her palm were damp. Not wet, not obviously so, but carrying a moisture the others had not. Beneath the surface of the pile, a fine gray dust rose when she disturbed the material, lifting in a small cloud before the air dispersed it. She stood from the stool, walked around to the other side, reached in there too. Same dampness underneath, same dust. She straightened and pointed to the far end of the yard. "That load goes there," she told the driver, who was already moving to leave. He stopped. "Ma'am, that load, separate from the others." She indicated the space she meant. He looked at the pile she was pointing to, and then back at the wagon, calculating whether this was worth a discussion. He decided it was not. He moved the wagon and unloaded it where she had indicated. She wrote in the ledger that night. She described the dampness, the dust, the way the material had felt different against her skin. She could not yet explain what was wrong with it. She only knew that something was, and that mixing it with the material she had been sorting all autumn seemed wrong in the same way that mixing a bad egg into batter was wrong. Not always disastrous, but preventable and therefore worth preventing. The firebox test came later that same week. Edgar had kept a small iron box with a hinged lid that he used to test coal samples before committing to a supplier. It was a simple thing, just an insulated chamber with small holes punched in the sides for draft, and she brought it out of the barn and set it on the bare dirt near the fence. She filled it with a sample from the pile she had been sorting as acceptable, closed the lid, and lit it through the draft holes with a taper. She watched the smoke. She noted its color, the rate at which it rose, the way it thickened or thinned as the material settled. She held her hand near the box without touching it and tracked how the heat built and held. When the material was nearly burned, she opened the lid and examined what remained. She let it cool, cleaned the box, and filled it with material from the rejected load. The difference was visible before the burn was 2 minutes old. The smoke came darker and faster and carried a sharpness underneath the sweetness, like something that had not fully dried. The heat spiked and then fell away unevenly, and when she opened the box, the residue was different in texture, clumping rather than crumbling, with a faint smell of damp char. She went inside and wrote 3 lines in the ledger. Then she put a small sample from each burn into 2 separate jars, labeled them, and set them on the shelf beside the others. She could not yet say what she had learned, but she had learned something and she would not lose it. Ezra Tully had run his pit at the south end of Lot, since before the town had a proper name, a low limestone structure with a corrugated roof and a smokehouse behind it that he managed with an attention to burning material that bordered on theology. He was 70 years old and held opinions about fuel the way a minister holds opinions about scripture. Firmly, without much interest in alternative interpretations, and with a quiet contempt for those who hadn't thought about it as long as he had. Odessa had known him for 20 years. She had bought smoked meat from him at the church sale and crossed paths with him at the feed merchant and exchanged, over those 2 decades, perhaps 40 words total. They were not friends. They understood each other, which was a different and in some ways more reliable arrangement. She came to Tully's on a Thursday afternoon carrying 2 plain paper bags, the kind the dry goods store used for flour in small quantities, and set them on the wooden table outside the smokehouse without preamble. He came out wiping his hands on a cloth and looked at the bags. "Pecan shells," she said. "Sorted and dried. Try them on whatever you'd like." He picked up one of the bags and squeezed it lightly through the paper, then looked at her over it. "Not asking you to pay for them," she said. "Not asking for anything. Try them. If they're worth something, we'll talk after." He set the bag back down and looked at it for a moment the way he looked at most things, as though deciding whether it deserved his continued attention. "All right," he said finally. She left without explaining further. There was nothing to explain yet. She was still in the stage of learning, and what she needed from Ezra Tully was not an opinion but a result. The result came the following week. She stopped by on a Wednesday and found him outside the smokehouse, filling a rack with brisket, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had performed the same sequence so many times the actions had become structural to his body rather than chosen. He did not look up when she approached, but he said, without stopping his work, that 2 of his regulars had commented on the smoke. He offered it as a statement of fact without interpretation, and she understood that in his lexicon this was a considerable thing. "Same 2 bags," she said. "Or different? How many you have?" She nodded. She was turning something over in her mind, measuring it against what she knew and what she didn't. "I'll bring more on Friday." He grunted, which she took for agreement, and she walked back toward the road while the afternoon light stretched long and yellow across the scrub grass, thinking about the difference between the 2 burns she had done behind the barn, and what it might mean if that difference held consistently at scale. Callum came that Saturday and found her in the barn measuring dried material into paper bags on the workbench. He stood in the doorway looking at the row of filled bags and the ledger open at the bench corner. What is that? Shells. She tied off a bag with a short length of twine, sorted and dried. He stepped inside and picked up one of the bags, turned it in his hands. You're selling these? Not yet. She opened the ledger to the current page without looking up. Right now I'm finding out if there's something worth selling. He set the bag down. She could feel him deciding whether to ask the next question, the one about why she was spending her mornings sorting through waste from a mill that had destroyed her gate and apparently felt no obligation to discuss the matter. She waited for it. He didn't ask it. Instead, he picked up the ledger and read the open page slowly, and she watched his face change, not dramatically, but in the small ways of someone encountering something unexpected in a place they had assumed contained nothing new. You've been recording every delivery, he said. Since September. He set the ledger down with something close to care. And Tully's buying from you. Tully's trying them. He looked at the row of bags again, then at the jars on the shelf. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and in the silence she heard something shift in him. A small reorientation she could not have named but could feel clearly, the sound a door makes when it settles differently in its frame. He fixed the latch on the barn door that afternoon without being asked, and when he left he said he'd be back the following weekend. She worked through October into November, sorting and drying and recording, the pile in the yard diminishing slowly as she converted it into sorted material, and the sorted material into paper bags, and the paper bags into deliveries to Tully, who said less each time she came and ordered more, which was how she knew the direction things were moving. It was in the second week of November that Cormac Dillard sent his young assistant to her gate with a folded note. The assistant was, perhaps 20, with a careful demeanor that suggested he had been given very clear instructions about how to deliver the message and nothing else. The note was short. Dillard ran the Falls Table on the main street of Lot, the kind of establishment where a man could sit at a cloth-covered table and eat food that required preparation rather than just heat. And he had heard that Ezra Tully was doing something different with his fuel. The note said Dillard would like to discuss the possibility of trying some material in his smoker. It asked her to come at her convenience, which she understood to mean at his convenience, and it was signed with a signature that managed to convey, even in 2 letters, a sense of self-importance. She went the next afternoon. The Falls Table was closed between services, and Dillard met her at the side entrance into the kitchen. He was a large man in his 50s, with the particular neatness of someone who had built his reputation on standards and intended to keep them visible. He showed her the smoker, a substantial unit that could hold considerably more than Tully's pit, and explained that Saturday was his primary service day, that he ran brisket as his anchor item, that his customers expected consistency, and that he had a reputation he was not in the habit of risking on unproven materials. She listened to all of this. Then she asked how much material he intended to use. He named a quantity. She was quiet for a moment. That's the full smoker. When I test something, I test it properly. He crossed his arms. Half measures tell you half of what you need to know. That was true, she thought. It was also true that a full smoker meant a large number of briskets, and that a full smoker run on materials she had not yet confirmed at scale was a risk she was accepting on his behalf as well as her own. She looked at the smoker. She thought about the burns behind the barn, the difference between the 2 piles, the quality of smoke she had observed. She thought about everything she had recorded in the ledger since September. She left 2 bags from the stock she had been building for Tully, told Dillard she would have sufficient material for Saturday, and walked home in the late afternoon with the November light pressing flat across the fields. She did not think about the risk exactly. She thought about what she knew and what the knowing was built on, and by the time she reached her gate she had decided the foundation was solid enough to stand on. What she had not accounted for was the delivery that arrived Thursday morning. She knew before the wagon finished unloading. The driver was a different man from the usual 2, younger, moving with less attention, and when she pushed her hand into the pile she felt it immediately. Damp, not throughout but in pockets, concentrated toward the bottom of the load where the material had been packed heaviest. The gray dust rose when she disturbed the top layer. She stood at the edge of the pile and felt the first cold movement of something going wrong. She could not refuse the delivery. It had already been unloaded. She had committed to Dillard for Saturday, and the material she had set aside in the barn was sufficient but only barely. She could not afford to replace any portion of it with material from this questionable load without contaminating what she had built carefully over 2 months. She spent Thursday afternoon doing something she had not done before, moving through the barn material piece by piece, not sorting by quality, but checking for anything that had somehow migrated from the outside pile to the inside stock. There was nothing. The separation she had maintained all autumn had held. She had been careful, and the care was paying off the way care usually pays off. Quietly, without acknowledgement, through the absence of disaster rather than the presence of triumph. Friday she spent on final preparation, working the drying and sorting with the attention she brought to anything that mattered. And Saturday morning before light, she loaded the bags into her wagon and drove to the falls table in the cold dark before dawn. Dillard was already there. She helped him fill the smoker and watched him light it, staying for the first hour of the burn because she wanted to see the smoke with her own eyes. It came clean and even, rising with a color and consistency she recognized from the best of her test burns, the heat building steadily without the spikes and drops she had seen with the questionable material. She watched it for an hour, then drove back to the farm. She was giving the chickens their morning feed when she realized she had left something unresolved. The Thursday delivery sat at the far side of the yard where she had moved it, separate from everything else, still untested properly. She finished with the chickens and went to the barn for the firebox. The burn told her what she had suspected. The material from Thursday was inconsistent. Some of it borderline acceptable, some of it clearly not, and the proportion was not predictable by sight. She was holding a load she could not trust, and a load she could not trust was a load she could not use for anything where consistency mattered. She wrote it in the ledger. She wrote exactly what she had observed and what it meant for the material's usability. And she noted the date of the delivery and the driver's name, which she had asked for and written down before he left Thursday morning, because asking for this information had become simply part of how a delivery happened at her property. It was late afternoon when Dillard's assistant appeared at her gate again. The boy looked pale, the careful composure of Friday entirely gone. She was already putting on her coat when he finished speaking. Callum was at the farm when she returned from Lot. He had come to do some work on the fence line behind the barn and had not expected to find his mother driving back in the wagon with her jaw set in an expression he recognized from childhood. The look she wore when she was carrying something heavy and had decided to carry it alone. He came to the fence and watched her unhitch the horse. "What happened?" he said, not asking. She told him about the briskets. She told him plainly without softening it, because she had never believed that softening the truth made it easier to carry, only lighter in the hand while heavier in the body. Dillard had been cordial, in the sense that a man can be cordial while showing you a bin full of ruined meat. He had said what he needed to say. She had heard it. Callum leaned against the fence post, and the material you sent was what you'd been using for Tully. Not exactly. She lifted the harness from the horse and carried it to the rail. The material I sent Dillard was from the same sorted stock, but I don't yet know if there was any crossover from Thursday's delivery. You think there was? No, she checked the horse's water. But I don't know, and not knowing is the problem. She turned and looked at the barn. The difference is somewhere in the shells. I've been feeling it all autumn, and I haven't put the reason to it yet. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Mama, there's a man who's been asking about this property. Reasonable offer. You could take it. Come live in town with us. Be done with." "Callum!" He stopped. "Go home tonight," she said. "Let me work." He looked at her. He had his father's patience when he chose to use it, and he used it now, drawing a breath and letting the argument go. He finished the fence work he had come to do and left in the early evening. And Odessa went into the barn and took the failed batch sample down from the shelf and set it on the workbench beside the samples from the loads she had used with Tully. She looked at them for a long time before she touched them. Then she picked them up, one in each hand, and began. The difference was there in the weight first. A subtlety she might have missed if she had not spent months training her hands to notice it. The shells from the successful batches sat heavier in her palm relative to their size. The failed material was lighter, not dramatically but measurably, in the way that a piece of timber just beginning to go soft sits lighter than sound wood. She selected pieces from each sample and set them side by side on the workbench, and in the lamplight she could see it in the cross-section. The walls of the failed shells were thinner. Not all of them. Enough of them. The thin ones collapsed under the pressure of her thumbnail where the thicker ones resisted. She picked up a pinch of the gray dust that had been drifting from the failed material since Thursday and rubbed it between her fingers. It was fine, almost powdery, the kind of dust that came from shells that had begun to break down, that had not been fully dry when processed or had absorbed moisture during storage. She held a piece of the thin material close to the lamp and pressed gently, and from the interior of the fragment something released, not wet but not dry either, the slight give of material still holding moisture deep in its structure where no surface preparation could reach it. Thin walls. Fine dust. Moisture locked inside rather than on the surface. She stood at the workbench with the two samples in front of her and the lamp burning, and she understood what her hands had been reading since September without knowing they were reading it. The good shells burned clean because they were dense and dry through and through. The bad ones flared and faded and turned the smoke bitter because they were burning off hidden moisture, turning it to steam, and then to char before the combustible material could hold a steady temperature. She wrote it down in 3 lines, plainly, the way she always wrote things she needed to be able to find again. Then she closed the ledger and sat for a while with the lamp turning low, thinking about what it meant to know the reason for a thing she had been doing by instinct, whether the knowing made the instinct more reliable or simply more explicable. She decided it was both. The instinct was what had kept her from mixing those loads since September. The reason was what would let her teach someone else to do the same, and to do it at a scale her hands alone could not manage. The scale was the problem she had not yet solved. She looked at the machine in the corner of the barn, the iron frame under its stiffened canvas, and thought about Edgar's careful hands on the threaded screw and the shape of the die at the end, and what he had been trying to make it produce. She did not think about Dillard's bin of ruined brisket as evidence of a mistake or a reason to reconsider. She thought about it the way she thought about any failure that left information behind. What it had shown her, and how to make sure it could not happen again. She pulled the canvas back from the machine and laid her hands on the cold iron frame in the low light, standing there for a long time, feeling the weight and shape of what Edgar had built, thinking about what it might be made to do. She would need Seth Moorfield. She would need to explain the problem before she could explain the solution. And she was not certain Moorfield would understand the problem without first making him see what she saw. She was accustomed to this. Most of the people she had ever needed to work with had required first that she make them see what she saw, and she had never found a way to do it except by being patient and specific, and refusing to accept the summary dismissal that came from people who had decided before listening. She let the canvas fall back over the machine, blew out the lamp, and stood for a moment in the dark of the barn, smelling the dried shells and the cold iron and the particular mineral smell of old wood in the darkness. Outside, the night was clear. The fog had not come back in from the river, and the stars over Falls County were close and countless in the way they got in autumn, when the air had dried out and there was nothing between the ground and the sky to soften the distance. She stood in the yard looking up at them for a moment before she went inside. The ledger was on the kitchen table where she had left it. She sat down without lighting a lamp and placed her hands flat on the cover in the dark, feeling the worn leather and the slight ridge where the pages were thicker in the middle than at the edges from use. And she thought about everything it contained. Every number, every observation, every dated jar on the shelf in the barn, and she thought about the fact that Callum did not know what was in it. He did not know what was in it, and until he did, he would keep seeing what he saw from the road. His mother sitting in a pile of someone else's waste, sorting it by hand for reasons she had not explained. She would explain it when there was something to explain. Right now, there was only a direction and a reason for the direction, and the slow accumulation of everything she would need to make the direction into a road. She would be up before the fog came in. There was more work to do. Seth Moorfield's shop stood at the east end of lot on a lot that had been a blacksmith operation since before the town incorporated, and the ground around it carried 30 years of iron filings, and coal dust worked so deep into the soil that nothing grew there except sparse dry grass managing to root in hardpack. The building was open on the south side, a wide working bay with a dirt floor packed smooth from use, and Moorfield was at the forge when Odessa arrived on a Monday morning with the machine loaded in the wagon bed. He was a man of 52 who had been doing this work since he was 11, and his hands showed it. The knuckles thickened, the fingers slightly curved from decades of gripping tools, the skin carrying the faint discoloration of a life spent near heat and metal. He looked up when the wagon stopped but did not come out immediately. He finished the draw he was working, set the piece on the anvil, then walked to the edge of the bay and looked at her. Mrs. Birch. She climbed down without help and went to the wagon bed and pulled the canvas back. I need you to look at something Edgar built. He came to the wagon and examined it without touching it, walking around the end to see it from the other side. Bending to look at the die assembly at the working end of the frame. He had known Edgar, not well, but the way men in a small town know each other from transactions and occasions, and he had enough respect for the quality of Edgar's practical thinking to look at this carefully. What did he use it for? Testing a tar compound for road surfacings. It never came to anything useful. She put her hand on the threaded screw. I want to change the die, make the opening smaller. Cylindrical about this across. She held her thumb and forefinger in an approximate circle. He looked at the measurement her fingers made, then at the die. What are you pressing through it? Pecan shells, ground and dried. He was quiet for a moment, the expression on his face neither skeptical nor accepting, just working through the mechanics of what she was describing. Ground to what fineness? Fine enough to pack under pressure without the pieces separating. I've been working on the grind. She reached into her coat pocket and brought out a cloth tied at the top, which she opened to show him the material inside. A pale, granular substance that was neither powder nor coarse meal, but something between. He took a pinch and rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, held it close, then let it fall. You're binding it. Cornmeal. Small proportion. He looked at the material again, then at the die on the machine. He walked back around the wagon to the working end, bent again, and spent a longer time examining the mechanism. Touching the threads of the screw, checking the alignment of the chamber with the die opening. When he stood up, he was nodding slightly, the movement barely visible, the particular nod of a man who has understood a mechanical problem and is already moving to its solution in his head. I'll need the machine here to fit the new die properly. He glanced at the wagon. You can leave it today. What will it cost? He named a figure. It was not unreasonable. She had what he asked from the egg money she had put aside over the autumn, and she paid him half in advance from the folded bills in her coat pocket. He wrote the amount in a receipt book on a shelf just inside the bay without making anything of the transaction. She drove home without the machine, which left a space in the barn that felt significant in a way she had not expected. The corner where Edgar's equipment had sat for 4 years was suddenly empty, and she found herself not looking at it when she moved through the barn that afternoon. The empty space was doing something the machine sitting untouched under its canvas had not been doing. It was asking a question. She spent the week preparing material. The grinding she had been doing with the stone hand mill Edgar had used for corn was adequate for small quantities but slow, and she worked at it in the mornings while the light was good and her back had not yet begun to complain, moving the stone in its circular track, checking the texture of what came through against the sample she had shown Moorfield. She dried each batch on flat metal sheeting set in the pale November sun, turning it with a wide wooden paddle to expose the material evenly, and she added the cornmeal in a small proportion she had arrived at through a series of tests in the weeks before, starting with a guess and refining toward a result. There had been 3 batches before she got the proportion right. The first crumbled when she pressed a handful between her palms. The second held its shape but was too dense, and when she burned it, the cornmeal dominated the smoke and left a sweetish residue she did not want near anyone's brisket. The third held shape and burned clean, and she had written the proportion in the ledger and not varied from it since. Moorfield sent word on Friday through the egg boy that the machine was ready. She brought the wagon back that afternoon, and he demonstrated the modified die by pressing a small batch of her prepared material through the machine, the cylindrical forms coming out the far end of the die at 1.5 inches in length, dense and dry, dropping into the receiving pan with a small sound she found satisfying. She burned 3 of them in the firebox she had brought in the wagon, and Moorfield stood beside her and watched the smoke without saying anything. Even, she said. Yes. He watched it a moment more. Whatever you've got in there is holding the temperature. She paid him the remainder of what she owed, loaded the machine back into the wagon, and drove home in the late afternoon feeling something she had not felt since September. Not confidence exactly, but traction. The difference between an instinct and a process was that a process could be repeated, and she had, in the course of one autumn, turned what lived in her hands into something she could do the same way every time. She did not send word to Dillard. She waited until she had 2 full bags of finished pellets produced on the modified machine with consistent results, then carried them to the Falls table on a Thursday and found him in the kitchen between services. She set the bags on the preparation counter without preamble. He looked at them. He looked at her. Different material, she said. Same source, different preparation. She did not explain further. What she was offering him was a result, not an account of how she had arrived at it. Saturday, I'll leave these with you now. If they don't perform the way they should, I won't come back. He looked at the bags for a long moment, then picked one up, turned it, set it back down. His expression carried the particular calculation of a man weighing a risk against the memory of a loss, and those 2 things were not pulling in the same direction. Then he said, leave them, and went back to what he had been doing before she arrived. Saturday she spent at the farm. There was work enough to keep her from thinking too much about the smoker on the main street of Lot, and she did it methodically. The winter preparation work that waited for no particular attention. She mended the section of coop wall that had been letting in drafts, cleaned the ash from the kitchen stove and the small parlor grate, turned the compost at the back of the kitchen garden. She was in the barn Sunday morning when she heard the wagon on the road. Something in the pace of it, the particular deliberateness of its approach, told her to walk to the gate. Dillard came alone, which was unusual. He drove his own rig, a neat-sided wagon, with the well-maintained look of a man who kept his equipment as carefully as his tablecloths, and he stopped at the gate and climbed down. He was a man who arranged his face with care in professional situations, but he was not arranging it now. He told her the smoke had run clean for the full burn, 4 hours, and then a low hold for 2 more. The bark had set dark and even across all 12 briskets without variation. He had pulled one at the 3-hour mark to check the interior and found it where it needed to be. The ring of smoke penetration clean rather than spotted, the color of the meat consistent through the cross-section. She listened without moving. He told her the texture had been different, tighter than he usually got, which he attributed to the evenness of the heat and the way the pellets had held temperature without the spikes and drops he had experienced with other materials. He offered this as a technical observation, and she recognized it as the way a man like Dillard shared praise, wrapped in specificity so that it retained his professional dignity. "Weekly," he said finally. "How much can you supply each week?" She told him the quantity she could reliably produce at current capacity. He said he wanted that quantity, named what he would pay per bag, and the number was higher than what Ezra Tully was paying. She had not expected that. She kept her face level while she considered it, working through what it meant for the hours the production required, and concluded that it was fair. "Friday delivery," she said. "I'll need the bags returned each week." He agreed and drove away, and she stood at the gate watching the wagon diminish down the road, then turned and went back to the barn and opened the ledger and wrote the date and the quantity and the price, and then sat for a moment with the pen in her hand. The following weeks moved differently from the weeks before them. She had been accumulating during the autumn, preparing, building toward a test she had not known she was building toward. And now the test was passed and the accumulation had a destination. She was producing for a purpose with a known recipient and a set delivery schedule, and the structure of that purpose organized her days in a way the sorting and the testing had not. 2 more customers followed Dillard before December was over. One was a man named Patterson, who ran a small Saturday operation 6 miles outside of Lot, nothing as formal as Tully's or Dillard's but steady, and who came to her gate having heard about the pellets from a man who had eaten at the Falls table. The other was a woman named Hargrove who kept a cookhouse for a crew of ranch hands to the north, and who sent her husband with a note asking whether the material could be sold in larger quantities. She sold to both of them. She adjusted her production schedule, set the morning hours as her preparation time and the afternoons for grinding and pressing, and built a weekly rhythm that moved without significant variation and produced a consistent yield. The barn shelf that had held dated jars all autumn now held 2 rows of finished bags, and the bags were systematically replaced by the orders that went out each week. Callum came on a Saturday in early December and stood in the barn looking at the operation with an expression she had seen before. The expression of a man encountering something he has missed while it was developing. He walked the length of the barn slowly, looked at the machine with its modified die, looked at the bags on the shelf, looked at the ledger open on the bench. How long has Dillard been buying? Since late November. He looked at the ledger page, which she had left open to the weekly production record. His eyes moved down the numbers. He had spent 15 years working with numbers professionally, and the habit of reading them quickly was involuntary. She watched him arrive at the weekly total and then at the per-unit price and do the multiplication. He did not say anything for a moment. "Then you should have told me. I'm telling you now." "Mama," he set the ledger down. "This is real. What you're doing here is real." She tied off the bag she had been filling and set it on the shelf. "I know it's real. I've known it was real since September." He had the grace to receive that without argument. He sat down on the low stool that had been at the edge of the pecan pile all autumn, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor and then back up at her. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now, nothing. But when the spring season comes and Weed's next processing run starts, I'll need to think about capacity." He nodded. He stayed for the rest of the afternoon, not working exactly but present in the way he had been when he used to sit in Edgar's workshop as a boy, absorbing a situation he was still trying to fully understand. She let him stay. There was value in showing him what the work looked like from the inside rather than describing it. And she understood that what he needed was not information but proximity. Weed's mill ran its primary processing season in the autumn, when the pecan harvest came in from the orchards and the wild groves along the river, and the deliveries to Odessa's property had continued through November at roughly the same interval. She had been sorting and drying the raw material and pressing it into finished product on a schedule that kept her inventory stable, moving enough through each stage to meet her weekly orders without accumulating large surpluses or running short. What she had not fully worked out was what happened when the orders grew larger than what her current process could produce. She had been operating at the limit of what one person working a modified hand press could achieve in a day, and she was aware that the limit was a wall she was approaching, not one she had hit yet, but one that was visible ahead. This was the state of things on the morning in early February when she found no wagon waiting at her gate. Weed's deliveries had been irregular through January. Occasional gaps she had attributed to weather or equipment issues, and worked around by drawing down her raw material inventory. But this gap extended past a week, then into a second, and when she sent the egg boy with a note to the mill asking about the schedule, she received nothing back. She drove to the mill herself on a Thursday. It was a 1.5 miles north of Lot on the River Road, a substantial operation with a main building and several outbuildings, the yard showing the accumulated material of a busy processing season. She pulled the wagon into the yard and asked for Harlan Weed. The man who came out to meet her was not Weed himself, but a younger man she did not know, who carried the manner of someone given authority to deliver a message and the clear preference not to have this conversation. He told her, standing in the yard with his hands at his sides, that the mill was making other arrangements for its shell removal. She sat with this for a moment. What other arrangements? He said a contractor from Waco had taken over the disposal contract effective the first of the month. She looked past him at the mill building. Through the open side of the loading dock, she could see shells piled along the far wall, the pale mounds of processed waste accumulating since the season ran. Mr. Weed is aware I have standing orders I'm supplying. The young man said he understood that, and that the decision had been made above his position to speak to, and that he was sorry for any inconvenience. She turned the wagon and drove back to Lot. The road was dry, the February air still and cold, and she drove without hurrying, because hurrying would not change what she had just been told, and she needed the time to think clearly. What she had was stock on hand, the raw materials she had accumulated through the autumn and winter, sorted and dried and in various stages of preparation. She had been careful with her inventory, and the numbers were in the ledger, and she could calculate exactly how many weeks of production the existing stock would support at her current output rate. The number she arrived at was not comfortable, but it was not immediate either. She had enough for several weeks. The question was whether several weeks was enough time to find another source. She drove home, put the horse in the barn, and opened the ledger to the supply section. She looked at the numbers. She knew how much raw material she needed per week to produce her standing orders, and she knew what condition it had to be in because she had spent months learning the difference between materials she could use and materials she could not. What she needed was a source, or more than one source, that could supply that quantity reliably. She thought about the territory she knew, the orchards and processing operations along the river bottom and up into the adjacent counties. She thought about the operations too small to interest a contractor from Waco, producing waste in quantities that would not justify a haul, but would add up between them. She had seen, driving through the county, the evidence of smaller pecan operations that managed their waste problems haphazardly, burning what they could, piling the rest against fence lines or in low ground where it gradually composted into the soil. She got out a piece of paper and wrote down every operation she knew within a day's wagon travel, however small. When she finished, she had 8 names. She crossed out 2 immediately, one that had ceased operating the previous year, one that was too far east to make the travel practical. 6 remained. That evening, Callum arrived. He had heard about the mill, which meant the information had moved through Lot, in the way information moved through small towns, faster than the wagon that carried it. He came in without knocking the way he had done since childhood and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at her at the table with the paper and the ledger. She could see what he had already decided. It was in the set of his shoulders, in the particular preparedness of his expression. The look of a man who has arranged his thinking into a position he considers reasonable and is ready to present it. There's still an offer on the table for this property, he said. The man who approached me hasn't withdrawn it. She looked at him across the table. Sit down, Callum. He sat. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to the production record. This is what I'm producing each week. This is what Dillard pays per unit, what Tully pays, what Patterson and Hargrove pay. This is the raw material cost, which until last month was 0. She moved her finger down the page. This is the margin. Look at it. He looked at it. She watched him read the numbers with the quiet precision of someone who worked with figures professionally. And she watched his expression move through what the numbers were telling him. The margin is real even with raw material cost, she said. What I need is supply. Not one source. Multiple sources close enough to make the travel practical, small enough that a Waco contractor won't bother with them. He was quiet for a moment. You've already thought about where? I have a list. She showed him the paper. He read the 6 names. He knew most of them, which was why she had shown him. He worked in Lot, moved through the commercial life of the county, knew who was buying and selling and who was struggling and who had more product than they knew what to do with. His finger stopped on one name. Thomas Whitley. He looked up. His operation in Hearn has been expanding. He bought 2 new machines last spring. More throughput means more waste. She had thought the same thing. He's 30 miles north. A long day's drive, Callum said, but his volume might make it worth it. His finger moved to another name, Roland Bass in Cameron. Smaller, but he's been piling shells behind his barn since he expanded the drying yard. I heard him say at the merchants' meeting in December that he was going to have to hire someone to remove it. She wrote Hearn and Cameron at the top of a fresh page. I'll go next week. Both of them. Callum looked at her. Something was working in his expression, a recalibration that had been in process since November, but was moving now more quickly, accelerated by what she had shown him in the ledger. I'll come with you. She considered refusing, then did not. Come because you're useful, she said, not because you're worried. He almost smiled. What's the difference? The first one stays quiet when the conversation is going well. She went to Hearn, on a Tuesday, Callum beside her on the wagon seat, the cold air off the river, working under their coats for the first hour of the drive before the morning, warmed enough to make the travel comfortable. The landscape along the road was the stripped-down winter version of itself, the fields cleared, the pecan trees bare, the sky a pale even gray that gave no particular indication of weather. Thomas Whitley's operation was visible from the road before they reached it. The main building, a well-maintained structure with a newer addition on the north end that marked the expansion Callum had mentioned. In the side yard, 3 large mounds of shell material stood against the fence line, covered partially with canvas weighted by stones at the edges. She estimated the volume at a glance, and then corrected the estimate upward. Whitley came out when he heard the wagon. He was a man in his 60s, heavier than the usual type for this work, with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to preserve himself over a long career. He looked at Odessa, then at Callum, then back at Odessa, and his expression carried the brief uncertainty that her presence sometimes produced in men who were not expecting to do business with a woman. She did not wait for him to resolve the uncertainty. She climbed down from the wagon and went to the fence line and put her hand on the nearest canvas-covered mound. "This is 3 weeks of accumulation," she said. It was not a question. Whitley's eyes narrowed slightly. "About that." She peeled back a corner of the canvas and looked at the material underneath, reached in and took a handful, turned it, let it fall. Good material, well-dried from the processing, minimal dust. She replaced the canvas. "I need consistent weekly supply. I'll tell you the quantity, the condition requirements, and the pickup schedule. You clear the waste without having to manage disposal." She looked at him directly. "Tell me what's wrong with that." He studied her for a moment. He was a man who had been doing business for 40 years and recognized a straight proposition when he heard one. "What condition requirements?" She described them. "Dry, no pockets of moisture, minimal fine dust, shells from completed processing rather than from floor sweeping." He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he asked the quantity she needed per week, and she told him, and he looked at the mounds against his fence line and then back at her. "I can do that," he said. "But if my volume changes, I need the flexibility to adjust. As long as you give me 2 weeks' notice, I'll adjust with you." He put out his hand. She shook it. Callum had remained on the wagon seat for the entire conversation. When they turned back onto the road toward Cameron, he said nothing for several minutes. "Then you knew he was going to say yes before we got there." "I knew his situation. He has waste he can't economically remove and no better option nearby." Yes was the rational answer. She watched the road. The condition requirements were the test. A man who pushes back on the conditions is telling you he can't actually meet them. Whitley didn't push back. Cameron was 25 miles west, a longer drive, and they arrived in the early afternoon. Roland Bass's operation was smaller than Whitley's but tidier, with the evidence of a man who ran things carefully despite limited resources. The shell pile behind the barn was substantial, the accumulated waste of a season that had apparently seen no removal at all. Bass came out of the barn when he heard them pull in, a lean man in his early 50s, with a watchful expression and hands that moved constantly, not from nerves but from the habit of someone always working through something. He looked at Odessa without the brief recalibration she had seen in Whitley, which she noted. She explained what she was offering in the same direct terms she had used in Hearn. Bass listened, and when she finished, he said, "You're the woman who's been selling pellets to Dillard." She had not expected that. "Yes. My wife's cousin ate at the Falls table in November." A brief pause. Said the brisket was the best he'd had in 10 years. She waited. "What you're paying per load," he said. "What does that look like?" She named a figure calculated carefully against her margin. He looked at the pile behind his barn with the expression of someone calculating the cost of what they are looking at. "I'll need you to start with what's already here," he said. "I've got to clear that before the spring season starts. I can take the first pickup next week." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You drove 25 miles to offer me a fair price for something I was about to pay someone else to remove." He was not asking. She said nothing. The statement was accurate and required no addition. He put out his hand. She shook it, and Callum wrote the terms in his pocket notebook, and they drove back toward Lot in the long winter afternoon, with the shadows coming early off the low hills and the horses moving steadily in the cold. Callum was quiet for a long time before he said, the man in Bass's voice when he talked about the brisket. He wasn't just making conversation. No. The product is good enough that people are saying so to people who don't have any reason to report it back to you. That's what Tully's customers were doing in October, she said. It's the same thing. He turned to look at her. But now it's reaching you from Cameron. She understood what he meant. The information had traveled 25 miles from an unremarkable dinner table through a chain of ordinary conversation to arrive in a barn in the next county, and it had arrived before her. The product was moving faster than she was. She sat with that for the rest of the drive, feeling its weight. There was a difference between knowing a thing worked and understanding how far its working had already spread, and the distance between those two things was, in its own way, a kind of measure. The first deliveries from Whitley and Bass came on different days of the following week. She had prepared for the logistics, setting up a receiving area in the yard where she could keep the two sources separate during initial assessment, before integrating them into the prepared stock. The Whitley material was clean and consistent with what she had assessed in his yard. The Bass material was more variable, the range of what had accumulated over an unmanaged season producing a wider spread of quality. She sorted the Bass material more carefully than she had anticipated needing to, pulling out the portions that did not meet her standards and setting them aside. The rejected proportion was higher than she liked. She noted it in the ledger and wrote a note she would send to Bass before the next pickup, describing specifically what she was finding and what the condition standard required. She did not blame him. He had not been producing for her specifications before this week. He needed to know what the specifications were in practice, not just in a verbal description in a cold barn in Cameron. She finished the note that evening at the kitchen table. Callum had stayed for supper, and he read the note when she passed it to him, then read it again. "You're not cutting him," Callum said. "Not over first material." He didn't know what I needed specifically until I showed him. If the second delivery has the same problems, that's a different conversation. He set the note down. "The Waco contractor Weed brought in, I heard he's already raised his rates once." She had not heard this. She looked up. "Weed didn't budget for variable pricing," Callum said. "He made an arrangement based on a flat rate, and the contractor changed the terms once the season started." He paused. "The shells are piling up. The dock crew has less room to work." She listened to this without showing what she thought about it. She had no interest in Harlan Weed's disposal difficulties. She had interest in what those difficulties might eventually produce, which was a different orientation entirely. "What I need right now," she said, "is to fulfill the Waco order." She had received word 2 weeks before from a regional supply warehouse in Waco that was consolidating barbecue and smoking supplies for distribution across 3 counties. The contact had come through Dillard, who had apparently mentioned her product to a buyer he knew, and the inquiry had been specific. Could she supply a full pallet shipment on a trial basis? A pallet was a different scale entirely from bags. She looked at the volume required and did the calculation against her current production capacity. She could not produce a full pallet from one pickup cycle of 2 sources on the schedule she had set. She could produce it if she combined the deliveries through a consolidation point. Edgar had used the freight yard and lot for rail transfers during the road contract years, and she knew the foreman there, a man named Aldrich, who ran the yard with the emphasis on logistics that kept a freight operation functioning. She drove to the yard and explained what she needed: a staging space where 2 incoming deliveries could be held and combined before she transported the consolidated load to her barn for processing. Aldrich looked at the timeline she described and said he could accommodate it for a reasonable storage fee. She paid the fee in advance. The pallet order came together over 3 weeks, the Whitley and Bass deliveries moving through the freight yard, and then to the barn and through the press in batches she tracked against the Waco specification at every stage. Callum came 3 times during those weeks, not to help with the physical work, but to sit at the bench and help her track the numbers against the delivery schedule, the kind of support that required the skills he actually had, rather than the ones he thought he was supposed to offer. The pallet went out on a Thursday, bound in canvas and roped at the corners the way Edgar had taught Callum to secure a freight load, loaded onto a wagon she had arranged with a freighter in lot named Corbin, who moved goods on a regular route that included a Waco stop. It left her yard on a cold, clear morning, and she stood at the gate and watched it go. The confirmation from the Waco warehouse came 8 days later. The buyer had tested the product against 2 other suppliers during the trial period. The pellets had performed at the top of the comparison on consistency, burn time, and smoke quality. He was interested in a standing order, monthly, at a volume larger than the trial pallet. She sat with the letter at the kitchen table and read it twice. Callum was not there. She read it alone, in the quiet of the kitchen in the early morning, and she thought about the sequence of things that had led to this letter arriving in her hand: the pile in the yard in September, the firebox behind the barn, the bin of ruined brisket at the Falls table, the modification to Edgar's machine, the drives to Hearn and Cameron in the February cold, the freight yard in Corbin's wagon, and the cold Thursday morning when the pallet had left her yard. The sequence was visible from here. Standing inside as it happened, it had rarely looked like a sequence. It had looked like the next thing, and then the thing after that, and each one had been the thing she could reach from where she was. She folded the letter and placed it in the back of the ledger, behind the last used page, and she sat for another moment with her hand on the cover. There was a larger question in the letter she had not yet addressed: whether she could actually produce at the volume the warehouse buyer was describing on a monthly basis. The calculation put her significantly above what her current press capacity could achieve, even with both sources running at full production. She had been turning this over since the first inquiry arrived, working through what a capacity increase would require. And she had arrived at a conclusion she did not entirely like. She needed more press time than she could produce alone. This meant either a second machine or a person to run the machine at hours when she was not available to run it herself. A second machine meant capital she did not have yet. A person meant a commitment she had not made before, the introduction of another set of hands into a process she had built by herself and understood better than anyone. She thought about the condition requirements note she had written to Bass, the specific and precise language she had used, because she knew the process well enough to know exactly what she needed. Teaching that specificity to another person was possible. She had done enough teaching in her life to know the difference between what was teachable and what was not. What she had built was teachable. The press, the grind, the drying protocol, the moisture check, the condition standards, all of it was something a capable person could learn if they were willing to be shown. What was not teachable was the accumulated autumn of observation that had preceded the method, the months of sorting and testing and recording that had produced the knowledge the method was built on. That part lived in her hands, in the ledger, and in the dated jars still sitting on the barn shelf. But a person did not need to have learned it the way she had learned it in order to apply it. They needed only to be shown the result of the learning, clearly enough to reproduce it reliably. She would need to find such a person. That was the next problem, and she could see its shape clearly from here, which meant she was ready to work on it. What she did not see, because she had not been told and had no reason to expect it, was that something was already in motion that would change the terms of what she was working toward. Not toward her directly, not yet, but in a direction she would soon need to account for. Silas Greer had been in Falls County for 3 weeks. She did not yet know his name. She learned it from Ezra Tully. Tully was not a man who passed information without reason, and when he mentioned Silas Greer on a Friday afternoon in March while she was making her weekly delivery, she understood that he was telling her something he thought she needed to know. He said it without decoration while he was stacking her bags against the smokehouse wall. A man had been asking around town about who supplied the pellets and what the process looked like and whether the woman running the operation owned the land outright or carried debt against it. She set down the bag she was holding. When? Last week. Then again Tuesday. Tully straightened and looked at her directly. He ate here Saturday. Asked about the smoke. A man asking about smoke quality at Tully's was unremarkable. A man asking about land debt was not. What did you tell him? That I bought bags of material from you on Fridays and the smoke suited me. He picked up the next bag without changing his pace. That's all I know. She drove back to the farm with the name sitting in her mind. Greer. She didn't know the name from commerce or from Lot's ordinary social channels, which meant he was not a local man, which meant he had come from somewhere with a specific purpose. Edgar's estate had been settled cleanly. The farm carried no liens. Anyone looking into the property's legal standing find a clear title in her name, which was a matter of public record at the county seat in Marlin, and the fact that Greer had been asking informally rather than going directly to the records suggested he was gathering information before approaching her, not instead of approaching her. She was not surprised when the wagon appeared at her gate on a Tuesday morning 10 days later. He was a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed for the county, in a way that was not ostentatious but deliberate. The clothing of someone who understood that appearance communicated before words did. He climbed down from the wagon with the ease of a man who had made many such visits to rural properties, and he came to the gate and introduced himself with the practiced manner of someone who had made a career of first impressions. She led him through the gate without comment. She had work to do, and she continued doing it, leading him to the barn where she was in the middle of a pressing run, the machine cycling steadily, the formed pellets dropping into the receiving pan. She did not stop the work. If he wanted to speak with her, he could speak with her while she worked. Greer looked at the machine with an expression she read as appreciation carefully modulated to seem casual. He looked at the bags on the shelf, at the ledger open on the bench, at the jars still standing in their row. He was taking inventory without appearing to take inventory, and she let him, because a man cataloging what he saw was also a man not yet ready to say what he had come to say. Mrs. Birch. He turned from the shelf. You've built something here that's genuinely impressive. She guided another batch into the press chamber. What do you want? The directness registered on him, a small adjustment in his posture. He was accustomed to a longer approach. I represent a group of buyers interested in acquiring regional production operations in the supply sector. Barbecue smoking specialty fuel. He paused. What you've developed here is exactly the kind of proven process they're looking for. You want to buy the process to supplier relationships, the customer accounts. He named a figure. $800. She set the pressing paddle down and looked at him, not with hostility, but with the same quality of attention she brought to a load of shells she needed to assess, a reading of what was actually present rather than what was being presented. $800 was more money than Edgar had earned in his best year of contract work. She understood why Greer had named it First and Large, because the number was designed to occupy the full field of her thinking before anything else could enter it. She was aware of what it was doing, and she let it do it for a moment, because a number that size deserved an honest consideration rather than a reflexive dismissal. What the number could not buy was what she had not yet fully extracted from what she had built. The Waco standing order was new. The two supplier relationships were proven but young. The production capacity question was not resolved. She was standing at the beginning of a scale she had not yet reached, and the beginning of a scale was the worst time to sell because the price reflected what existed rather than what was about to exist. "I'm not selling," she said. She picked up the pressing paddle. Not at this stage. He had expected this. The response he offered was gracious, confirming that it had been an opening position rather than a final one, and he told her his offer would remain available if she changed her mind, and he left with the same controlled ease with which he had arrived. She pressed 3 more batches before she stopped and went to the barn door and looked at the yard where his wagon had stood. The ground showed nothing but the ordinary marks of use. That evening she wrote in the ledger what she knew about Greer, the date of arrival, the offer amount, the specific items he had named in the acquisition, the land debt question he had asked Tully. She wrote it down because writing things down was how she kept them from becoming distorted by memory. And she had learned that a man who asked about your obligations before he asked about your product was a man calculating leverage, and leverage was worth tracking. What she had not accounted for was Seth Moorfield. She found out 3 days later. She had gone to the smithy for an adjustment to the die, and when she arrived, Moorfield was at the forge with his back to the door. He turned when he heard her, and something moved across his face before he arranged it into his working expression. A brief passage of something she would have called discomfort in a man less controlled. She set the die piece on the bench and described the modification. He listened, picked it up, examined it. While he was examining it, she looked at the drafting shelf on the wall where he kept his working drawings. The shelf had been reorganized recently. She could tell by the dust pattern, the clean strip where papers had been moved. She did not ask him about it then. She described the modification clearly, confirmed the timeline, paid the advance, walked back to the wagon, sat for a moment before picking up the reins. She drove to Lot, left the wagon at the livery, and walked to the county clerk's office. She spent 20 minutes at the records desk, looking through the recent filings in the commercial section. There was nothing filed under Greer's name, but there was a filing under the name of a company she did not recognize, an entity registered in McLennan County, that had recorded a letter of intent related to mechanical specifications for a pressing apparatus in Falls County. The filing was dated 6 days ago. She read it twice. The language was careful and general, the kind of language written by someone who knew how to record an interest without fully specifying what the interest was. But the dimensions referenced in the attachment, a threaded screw mechanism with a cylindrical die, were specific enough. She walked back to the livery, collected the wagon, drove to the smithy. Moorfield was where she had left him, and he turned when she came back through the opening of the bay, and this time he did not arrange his face quickly enough. She came directly to the bench and stood on the other side of it and looked at him across it. "The drawings for the modification I commissioned in November. Where are they?" A pause. "On the shelf." "Are they?" She did not look at the shelf. She watched him. The silence between them contained its own answer. He was a man who had been doing honest work for 30 years and was not constructed for sustained deception, and after a moment he set down the piece he was holding. "A man came in last week," he said. "He asked to see the drawings for the die work I'd done for you. I told him they were proprietary to a client." Another pause, shorter. "He made an offer for a copy. Did you give him one?" The pause this time was the longest. "I told him I needed to think on it." She looked at him. He had not yet given Greer the drawings, but he had not refused. And Greer had filed a letter of intent on the basis of an expected delivery. The window between the intent and the delivery was open, and she was standing in it. "What did he offer you?" He named a figure, less than she would have expected, which told her Greer was either undervaluing what the drawings represented or was confident enough of acquiring them that he had not needed to pay properly for the cooperation. "I want to buy the drawings," she said. "All of them. The original die specification, the modification work from last month, everything you have on file for my equipment. I'll pay you what he offered plus 20%. He was quiet, working through something, the arithmetic or the principle of it or both. She waited. "You understand I might have taken his money," he said finally. Not an apology and not quite a confession, just a statement of what had nearly happened. "You didn't," she said. "That's what matters to me right now." He went to the shelf and pulled the drawings, the full set, and she checked them against her memory of what the modifications had involved, confirmed that the set was complete. She paid him what she had named, money from the Waco deposit she had been holding in the cash box at the farm. It was more than she had planned to spend this week. She drove back to the farm with the drawings on the seat beside her, rolled and tied, and she thought about what they represented and what she had just prevented. Greer had a letter of intent on a set of drawings that no longer existed in any form he could acquire. He did not yet know that. He would find out when Moorfield told him, and what Greer chose to do when he found out would tell her something further about him. What he chose to do, as she learned from Tully the following Friday, was leave Falls County. He settled his account at the boarding house on the main street and drove his wagon north toward Waco and did not come back. She wrote it in the ledger, the date, the departure, what the departure meant for the filing in McLennan County, now a letter of intent for drawings that its named party could not produce, and therefore a dead instrument. She noted the lesson of it, which was not that she had been clever, but that information available in public records was available to her as much as to anyone, and that the practice of checking those records regularly was a practice she should maintain. She returned the following week to the clerk's office, not because she expected to find anything, but because returning was how practices became habits. She found nothing new, left, and went back to the work. March ran into April. The weather shifted, the days lengthening and warming, the river bottom beginning to move through the particular green of its early season, and the pecan trees putting out their first small leaves in a pale cloud that spread through the grove to the south of her property. She watched the seasons move the way she always watched them, with the attention of someone who understood that the seasons were the structure inside which everything else happened. The Waco standing order was running. She had solved the capacity problem through a method she had not anticipated, which was Callum. He came on Saturdays and pressed 2 full batches, learning the machine with the methodical attention he had always given to systems he needed to understand. Asking questions, she answered specifically, and in the same language she would have used with anyone capable of understanding the answer. After 3 Saturdays, he was producing at her quality standard without additional oversight, and she shifted her Saturdays to preparation and drying while he ran the press. It was not the arrangement she had imagined when she thought about adding capacity. She had thought about a hired hand, a stranger she would train from the beginning. What she had instead was Callum, who had made his own journey from the man who stood in her yard in September, seeing a pile of someone else's waste, to the man who now stood at her machine on Saturday mornings, pressing pellets with the same care she would have applied. The journey had been his, and she had not directed it, only let him be present long enough to take it. He came on a Saturday in late April, and she was at the bench with the ledger when he arrived, working through the quarters numbers. He went directly to the machine, checked the grind she had prepared, settled into the work. After a while, she became aware that he had stopped. She looked up. He was standing with a pellet in each hand, one from the current batch, one from the receiving pan of the previous run, comparing them the same way she had compared shell samples in November, turning them, feeling their weight, looking at the surface texture. "This one pressed tighter," he said, holding up the one from the current batch. She put down her pen, came to the machine, looked at what he was holding, took both from him. He was right. The difference was small, within acceptable range, but it was there. "Moisture content of the grind," she said. "The bass material this week was wetter than last week's delivery. I compensated in the drying time, but not fully." She handed them back. "The burn will be slightly uneven. Not enough to fail, but enough to notice." He set them down carefully. "I'll check the next batch against this one before I run it." She went back to the bench. She sat for a moment without opening the ledger, listening to the machine resume its rhythm. The Waco buyer's name was Franklin, and he came to the farm in May. She had not expected a personal visit, the relationship having been conducted entirely through correspondence and freight, but he arrived on a Wednesday with the practical air of a man who preferred to look at the things he was buying, rather than simply receiving reports about them. He was younger than she had expected, mid-40s, with the quick movements of someone who covered a lot of territory on a regular basis. She showed him the barn, the machine, the process from grind to finished product. She showed him the ledger's production records without showing him the supplier and pricing sections. He asked about the supplier chain, and she described it accurately without giving him the names, which he accepted without pressing. He stood in the barn looking at the shelf of finished bags and the machine in the ordered workspace, and his expression was the expression of someone matching what they expected against what they found and finding the match favorable. "You're under capacity," he said, deliberately. She was not apologetic about it. "I won't produce more than I can guarantee at standard. When I can guarantee more, I'll produce more." He looked at her. What would it take to double current output? She had thought about this enough to answer directly. A second press and a person to run it reliably. "The second press is the same machine, and I know where to have one made. The person is a question I haven't fully resolved." He was quiet for a moment. "If I commit to a volume that requires doubled output, I'm assuming the risk that you'll reach that capacity." "No," she said. "You're not. If I commit to a volume, I produce it. I don't commit to volumes I can't produce." She held his gaze steadily. "If you want double the current order, give me 60 days. If I can meet it in 60 days, I'll take the commitment. If I can't resolve the capacity in 60 days, I'll tell you before the commitment starts, not after. He looked at the machine again, then at her. 60 days. 60 days. He left without naming a higher volume, which was the correct response, and she understood it as a man deciding to believe she meant what she said and waiting to see if she was right. She ordered the second machine from Moorfield that same afternoon. He built it over 3 weeks from the specifications of the first, with the modifications already incorporated, so she did not need to go through the testing process twice. She paid him in 2 installments, the first from the Waco deposit, the second from the April production revenue. When the machine was delivered and installed in the barn, she ran it herself for a full week to confirm it performed identically to the original, pressing batches in parallel and comparing the output at every stage. The person questioned took longer. She had been thinking about it since February, turning it the way she turned difficult things, approaching from different angles, looking for the shape of the answer. What she needed was not strength or speed, but precision and attention, someone who understood that the process required consistency above every other quality. She had seen what happened when consistency failed, in the bin at Dillard's in November, in the slightly off-ratio batch in April, and she had no interest in scaling up only to produce failures at higher volume. Callum raised it first, on a Saturday in May when the second machine was installed and running beside the first, and the barn was for the first time genuinely loud with production. He came in during a run, looked at both machines working, looked at her managing the grind supply for both simultaneously. "You need someone here through the week," he said. "I know. I've been asking around." He leaned against the bench. "Margaret Aldrich, the freight foreman's wife, she's been looking for work since the winter. She's organized, she follows instruction. She's not going to take shortcuts." Odessa thought about Margaret Aldrich, whom she knew from the church ladies' circle well enough to have a clear impression of. Precise, consistent, not the kind of woman who improvised where the instruction was clear. "Send her to me this week." Margaret came on a Thursday and spent 4 hours in the barn, first watching, then attempting each stage under observation, then attempting the full sequence of a single batch from grind through pressing with Odessa watching without intervening unless the deviation was significant. At the end of the 4 hours, Odessa walked her through the ledger's quality section, the condition standards and what each one meant in practice and why. Margaret looked up from the ledger. "You built all of this." Odessa took the ledger back. "I built it out of what I was paying attention to." Margaret started the following Monday at a rate Odessa named, based on the margin the additional output would produce, not on what she thought a woman's labor was worth in Falls County in 1884, which was a different and lower number. Margaret did not comment on the rate, only nodded, which told Odessa she had arrived at a number Margaret considered fair. By the end of May, both machines were running through the week, one under Margaret's management during the day, one under Odessa's, and the Saturday sessions with Callum shifted to inspection and record review rather than production. The output had doubled. The quality held. She sent word to Franklin and Waco before the 60 days were complete. June came in warm and dry, the heat of a Texas summer beginning its advance earlier than average, and the pecan trees in the grove put out their full canopy, while the grass in the fields turned from green to the pale gold of drought-anticipating growth. Odessa's days had changed shape. The barn had noise in it all morning, the rhythmic cycle of 2 machines, and the finished product accumulated faster than she had been managing alone, which meant the ledger entries were more frequent, the weekly tallies larger, the cash box in the kitchen heavier than she had been accustomed to managing. She was at the freight yard in Lot one Thursday morning in late June, coordinating a combined delivery from Whitley and Bass, when Corbin the freighter came through the yard on his return from Waco and stopped to give her a message Franklin had sent with him rather than through the mail. A note asking whether she could handle a third account, a new distributor in Hillsboro that wanted supply terms. She stood in the freight yard with the note in her hand and thought about what the question meant and what the answer was. She had capacity for additional volume. The supply chain was producing consistently. The quality standard was holding. She wrote her response on the back of the note and gave it back to Corbin, who turned his wagon north again. She went home and opened the ledger to the revenue section and worked through the full quarter. The number at the bottom of the column was larger than she had ever written in that position, larger than she had anticipated when she started building toward the Waco order in February. And she sat with it the way she sat with important things, giving it her full attention for a moment before deciding what it meant. It meant the operation was real in a way that the earlier weeks had not yet made undeniable. The early months had been real, each stage genuinely built on the last, but the scale had been small enough that a skeptic, Callum, in September, or anyone else who had seen her sitting on a low stool beside a pile of waste shells, could reasonably have called it marginal. The number in the ledger was not marginal. It was the kind of number that answered the question she had stopped asking. She heard the wagon on the road in late July on a Friday morning when she was in the barn supervising a drying run. The sound of it was familiar before she identified why, the weight of it, the particular rhythm of the wheels on the summer dry road, and she walked to the barn door. Harlan Weed's wagon stopped at the gate. He was alone. She had not seen him since the day she went to his mill in February, and the young man had told her about the Waco contractor. And in the months since that conversation, the mill had been present only through the absence it had created, the gap she had filled with Whitley and Bass, and the discipline of building a supply chain she controlled. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him climb down. He came to the gate and stopped there. He was a man who did not remove his hat casually, and he did not remove it now, but something in the way he stood at her gate was different from the manner he had carried at the mill in February, when the young man had spoken for him. He had no intermediary today. She walked to the gate. She left it latched. Mrs. Birch. He looked past her at the barn, at the second wagon Corbin had left in the yard from Thursday's delivery, at the organized evidence of a functioning operation. I understand you've been doing well. She waited. He looked at her directly, which she respected, because a man in his position coming to her gate had to look at her directly or not come at all. The contractor arrangement hasn't worked the way I planned. The rates changed and the schedule hasn't held. He stopped. The shells are backing up. She said nothing. She had heard this from Callum in the spring, noted it, and what she had done with the information was leave it in the ledger as a potential future variable and continue building the operation she had built without accounting for it. She had built it without weeds material and it worked without weeds material, and that fact was the thing she needed to know before this conversation could happen on any terms she was willing to accept. I'm looking to reinstate a removal arrangement, he said. I'm not looking for additional raw material right now, she told him. My current supply covers my production needs. Something moved across his face, the adjustment of a man who came expecting to offer a solution and found that the problem had already been solved without him. I see. A pause. I was under the impression the operation had grown substantially. It has. More operation would require more material. More material requires supply I can rely on. She held his eyes. The last supply arrangement I had with your mill ended without notice. I built what I have now on sources I've been able to depend on. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gate between them. He was a man of the county of a certain generation and a certain position, and the gate was doing more than its ordinary work right now, representing the line between what had happened in September 1883 and what was happening today in July 1884. He was on the same side of it he had been when his men drove away laughing, but the weight he carried there was different. What would it take, he said. She looked at him. She had thought about this question for a long time, without knowing she was thinking about it. From the February morning, when the young man at the mill dock told her about the Waco contractor, right through to this morning. The answer had been forming out of everything she had learned since September, and it was complete. She unlatched the gate. He followed her into the barn. Callum was not there, which meant that when she opened the ledger on the bench and laid out the terms, she was speaking for herself entirely, and that was the way she preferred it. She described the weekly volume she could take, the condition standards she required, the pickup and delivery schedule. She described the quality inspection she conducted on every load, which meant any delivery that did not meet standard would be returned at his cost. She described the pricing structure, which was not the pricing structure of a woman receiving a favor, but the pricing structure of a business providing a service that the other party had already demonstrated it could not replace. Then she told him the last condition. Because she would be processing weeds' full waste stream on a reliable schedule, removing the operational problem that had been backing up his loading dock since February, the arrangement would include a handling allowance paid per delivery, in advance of each scheduled pickup. He looked at her across the bench. The lantern was lit against the morning shade of the barn, and in the lamplight, he was looking at the ledger the way Callum had looked at it in December, with the expression of a man encountering a document that contained more than he had expected to find. You're asking me to pay you, he said, for material I was delivering free. She had thought about how to answer this, and what she had decided was that the answer did not require softening, because softening it would make it smaller than it was. You were delivering it free because it was costing you money to hold, and you had no better option. Now you have an option, but you need it more than you needed it before. She looked at him steadily. That's not a condition I set. That's a condition you created. He stood at the bench for a long time. She let the silence hold. Outside the barn, the summer day was building its heat, and through the open side she could hear the ordinary sounds of the yard, the chickens, the wind in the pecan canopy to the south, the sound of the road in the distance. All right, he said finally. She turned the ledger to face him and tore a page from the back, blank, kept there for this kind of purpose, and wrote the terms on it in the plain language she used for everything she wanted to be unambiguous. She wrote 2 copies, read both copies against each other to confirm they matched, then signed the first and pushed it to him. He signed both copies without asking to read them a second time, which she noted as the behavior of a man who had already decided before he came to the gate and was ready to be done with the deciding. He took his copy. She kept hers, folding it into the ledger, between the pages that held the record of everything that had come before it. He left without saying anything further, which was appropriate. What remained to say was nothing. The gate was unlatched when he walked through it, and she did not follow him to the road. She heard his wagon pull away, the familiar weight of it diminishing down the summer dry road. She stood in the barn for a moment. The 2 machines sat quiet, waiting for the afternoon session. The ledger was open on the bench. Through the wall, she could hear the chickens moving in the yard the way they always moved, with the particular indifference of animals that have witnessed a great deal without filing an opinion about any of it. She opened the ledger to the supply section and wrote the date and the new supplier's name and the terms in the appropriate columns, the same way she had been writing every other entry since September. Just a fact among facts, another line in the accumulating record. Callum arrived that Saturday to find both machines cleaned and ready for inspection, the ledger updated through the previous day, and his mother at the kitchen table with the cash box open, working through the weekly accounts. He came in without knocking, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, came to the table. She pushed the ledger to him and let him read the new entry. He read it once, then looked at her. Then he looked at it again, reading the terms more carefully this time. The volume commitment, the condition standards, the handling allowance. When he looked up the second time, his expression was that of a man doing arithmetic on something larger than he had anticipated and arriving at a number that changed the scope of everything adjacent to it. He's paying the handling allowance, Callum said, per delivery, in advance. He set the ledger down. He looked at the window, at the July light, coming through it flat and strong across the kitchen floor. And he seemed to be working through the full distance between the morning in September when he had stood beside his mother, looking at the pile in the yard, and this morning, and finding the distance longer than he had measured it. You need me to draw up a formal contract document, he said. The page in the ledger will do. Mama. He looked at her. This is the kind of arrangement that deserves a proper document. She considered this. He was right. Not about the arrangement's validity, which was not diminished by a handwritten page, but about what a formal document represented for the next conversation, the one after this one, with the next buyer or the next supplier or the next man who came to her gate, thinking she was a woman with a pile of waste shells and an uncertain future. Draw it up, she said. He came back Wednesday with the document, 2 pages, properly formatted in the language he used for commercial instruments, and she read it in full before she signed it. The terms were exactly as she had written them, rendered in the formal language of a contract, but not softened or complicated by that language. She signed it and he witnessed it, and she put it in the ledger beside the handwritten page, which she kept as well, because she had learned by now that there was value in having more than one record of the same fact. The first delivery under the new arrangement came the following Monday. The wagon arrived early, which she had not specified, but which told her Weed had communicated the schedule to his crew with some emphasis. The driver was the same young man who had told her about the Waco contractor in February, and he looked at the yard and at her, with the expression of someone who had thought about this moment and was not sure what to do with it now that it was here. She directed him to the receiving area and supervised the unloading. She walked the inspection the way she walked every inspection, taking samples from different sections of the load, checking condition against standard, noting the weight against the delivery slip. The material met standard. She signed the slip and gave him his copy. He drove away and she stood in the yard with the sun already building toward its summer height and the pecan trees full and green to the south and the barn behind her where 2 machines waited, and a woman named Margaret would arrive in an hour to begin the day's pressing. Callum's handwriting was in the ledger and Edgar's handwriting was in the back pages she hadn't used, and her own handwriting filled everything between, and the cash box in the kitchen held money that had been waste shells in September and was something else entirely now. She went into the barn to start the grind for the morning.